I haven't given a soft talk like this for a while, but there's bias in everything we do. And as I was researching this talk, I just encountered more and more interesting information. So I'd love to take a walk through that. Because we're talking about bias, I figured it was important to give you some of my own bias. So I want to give you a quick history of my career journey so that when I start to talk about SRE and DevOps and things later on, you'll know where I'm coming from. So this is my biased journey, my biased baseline, how I got to today. Just a couple of points I'll make here, because I think probably many people had a similar experience who have been in the industry for a while. And that is that there's all this lore from the beginning of the internet, from the first ARPANET connection and the emergence of TCP/IP and all of these things. I've been fortunate to be around for some of this. For me, it was the 90s that really defined system administration. Before the 90s, it was really an arcane mix of technical work, and I'm not even sure we called it sysadmin. We really had Unix wizards back in those days who knew how to do all the magical things. Automation has made that a lot easier now. But more importantly, and the reason it was the golden age of sysadmin is really because of Perl. In the 90s, Perl and Unix came out and finally made it easy for us in the administrative to use automation and code to solve problems. Before that, it was the dark ages. So in 2004, SRE happened in Google. I don't know about you. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know anything about it until I was well along the DevOps conversion. And then suddenly this Google thing happened, and I ended up pivoting from one to the other. And actually, I feel like that was kind of a step back, although I'm an SRE director today, and I'm very happy, and I love the field. So this is a talk that's based in love, right? All right, so we've moved ahead a little bit, so you've already had a chance to absorb this. Where is this from? This is actually the Urban Dictionary definition for sysadmin. It's the #1 rated entry. And this is just to say that there have been tropes and stereotypes associated with dev and ops and SRE going around for a while. And we definitely want to look at them. Before we get there, though, let's talk a little bit about bias. This is an imperfect definition, but I wrote it based on I study. But the point is that your brain has ways of interpreting information, of changing memories, of processing things to make it easy for you to understand, and those almost always involve some kind of bias. We want to make complex problems simple, we identify with things that we know, so on and so forth. So if you go to, again, Wikipedia, and you look up cognitive bias, and if you take one thing away, I would encourage you to go look at this chart and start to read some of the things on it, because it's amazing how many times you'll say, oh, yeah, right, I did that. There's many, many ways to process information sort of incorrectly. We deal with a lot of these, as you can see, there's a lot of common ones. A few that I would call out here, actually my favorite on this list is exponential growth bias. I almost did a talk on that, which is the tendency of people to describe something as being exponential when it's really not. And those of us who know the math, which is everybody in the room, probably roll our eyes and think, oh, what? Deformation professionnelle is the one that's highlighted here, and there's a few blue highlights because they play into the narrative here, which is confusion around what SRE is supposed to be, and is it born of bias? Speaking of bias, let's take a look at some more stereotypes. So stereotypes are generally negative. It's taking a piece of behavior and applying it to an entire group sort of indiscriminately, and usually negative. So I've tried to be even here in my bias presentation, some dev bias, some ops bias, or SRE bias. And brilliant jerk is in the middle because I think that just transcends position, right? You can run into brilliant jerks everywhere. And this last one is interesting. This is what I was hearing back in the mid-2010s when we were doing DevOps conversion work, converting work styles to DevOps, and I would hear this. But actually, this is really the SRE origin story. I mean, SRE is born of bias. Let's go back to the man himself, right? It's what happens when you take one discipline, you ask it to solve the problems in another one. This was always troubling to me because I was trying to apply it as the rule of how to do SRE. And it Took me a while to realize it's not. It's like a bias. It's saying this is a fundamental underlying philosophy. My practical experience is that you can't solve everything with code. You can't solve everything with automation, especially as you get further into the ops realm. But I'm happy to be debated on that point. So what is SRE? It's a whole bunch of stuff. And the important thing here, so these are all the things that we're familiar with. When I look at SRE, I think of basically 3 buckets of work. I think of work that's related to on-call or production reliability, and then I think of collaborations that are done with engineering teams doing various things, and then I think of work that my team will do on their own, for example, to build tooling or observability or other things. But the reality is that the on-call time is not discretionary, and the other 2 kind of are. And so that can create some problems because if you're just a rebranded ops team, for example, you can't ignore the non-discretionary work, the on-call, the production support, and that can subsume all the rest of the time. Anyway, that's one of the reasons why I think people have difficulty implementing SRE. It's kind of an obvious thing now. Why is it hard? And saying, well, you're not Google is not really helpful. So what are some of the differences? As I mentioned before, I think that there's a number of things that automation can't solve. I think there's also a lot of practical situations where you decide not to solve it because the business needs something different, and that's okay, even if it means you divert a little bit from a founding principle. But looking to SRE to solve every day-to-day problem you have with that philosophy of software modeling operations is probably a bad tactic. There are some very real differences between Google and the rest of us in terms of the maturity, the investment, that make it very hard for people who don't have that capability to produce the same outcome. And one other thing I would point out is that if you don't have high-performing services, if you have trouble, and most of us have some level of trouble, it really makes this difficult because you suddenly have no discretionary time. You also can't implement, like you can't do error budgets if you don't hit your SLA, right? Also, there are plenty of times, again, where the business says, yes, we know, we want you to do it anyway. So it's kind of a confusing place to be. And this term origination bias has really just been used narrowly around paper publication, really, for scientific literature. I just found it really captivating because of the line about viewing the results of the original file as being sacred. And I think sometimes the Google SRE practice feels sacred. But if you really love it, you want to be able to be critical at the same time. So Google would say, well, SRE is an instance of DevOps. And I say, is it? It's never really felt that way to me. It's felt different, actually. When I was doing DevOps work, everything was about coming together and collaborating and sort of assigning things out with collective understanding. When I look at SRE, it's about the reliability mission and about some very specific pillars that are used to achieve that mission. These feel like two different things to me. And if you examine them structurally, you can also see that. So if we look a little bit at team topologies, this is some work that Matt Skelton and Manuel Pace have done. And they've studied a lot of different companies and tried to represent how they were organized for dev and SRE and ops and so forth through Venn diagrams. And I would certainly encourage you to read this article because it's really pretty amazing. And here you can see some of the differences that I highlighted, and obviously that doesn't mean that one can't be an instance of another, but it just goes to show you that they actually are very different in practice, I think, in the way that they're set up. For me, when I was in the middle of doing DevOps work in, let's say, 2015, and SRE came along, I found myself sort of there were more barriers coming up, and there were more people to talk to, and it actually reintroduced some of the problems that DevOps was supposed to fix. And now, actually, I don't know how many of you read, just a few months ago, there was an article, Devs Don't Like to Do Ops. Anybody read it? Google it and take a look. It's pretty interesting. And the idea is, has the time come to pull them apart again, is sort of the sentiment of the article. Because from a practical perspective, there are a lot of devs who don't want to worry that much about it. So, we look at it a different way. Is SRE just a rebranded tech ops? This chart is from the Google book, and it defines the level of engagement that SRE should have over the life cycle of a product from conception to end of life. This is sort of intuitively obvious, I think, and it's certainly not the way it has worked in many of the places that I have looked at. In those situations, it's been something more like this, which is that SRE is a valued part of the organization and consulted at various levels, but it's not until something really needs to happen often that you get the call, oh, yeah, I need to go live, so don't we have to have a conversation? So this is essentially the wall coming back, right? The throwing it over the wall thing. And we talk in SRE about production readiness as being an important component, but production readiness can become a wall too, if it's just the thing that you have to throw something over to get it into production. Now, I guess you could say, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And I'm pretty committed to the SRE mission. I think the most important thing is to understand the environment that you're operating in and whether there are biases that are controlling things. And so in order to do that, the first thing is to take a really good look at your workplace and see if you have these three ingredients. Because if you don't have these three ingredients, it doesn't mean it's a bad place, but it means that there's less likelihood of outcomes maybe that are important to you if you're worried about bias. So things like, can I report something? Will it be handled? Will I be anonymized? Will I be protected? And will something actually happen as a result? That's a hugely powerful motivator for folks in the rank and file, for everybody really, but particularly if you're at a position in the org where you don't have a lot of power. One thing I hear a lot actually related to SRE as a practice is the org chart doesn't matter. We're all working on the same stuff. But again, looking at it from a bias perspective, the org chart actually matters a huge amount. Because if you're not at the top of that org chart, if you're at the bottom of that org chart, you actually don't have any organizational power. And so sometimes a manager or a director will say, well, if you have ideas and conviction, and you make the argument, you can sell any team and get your agenda across. And I think most of the time, that's projection. Like if that individual can do it because they have the title, you or I try to do it, very often we encounter a wall of resistance. So that's workplace equity. The other piece of this pie is organizational bias. Are there things about your organization that introduce bias? And this is a little trickier, so this is sort of more directed at people who are leaders in their organization. Are you looking for whether or not there is bias? The most positive way to look at this is, do you know if the people that you hired and the teams that you assembled produced good outcomes, and do you know why? And there may be lessons in there about how people are selected and retained and promoted and cared for that are really important. And then, do you actually go and inspect and look for bias? Most companies they look for things like, do I have a workforce that looks like the population around me? Do I have pay equity? Those things are all sort of anchoring concepts here. But in terms of the professional bias that I'm talking about, it needs to go a little deeper. So for example, one of the best questions a candidate ever asked me interviewing was, are the job codes for SRE equitable to the job codes for other professionals at the same level? That's a really, really powerful question. Thankfully, I had a good answer. That hasn't always been true. And so, those kinds of differences have a huge impact on how somebody's motivated to deliver at work and feeling like you belong. So I'm going to leave it there. I think we have a few minutes left for questions if there are any. And I'm happy to be contacted on social media as well. Thank you.